Well, hello everyone. It's the final talk. You made it this far. Well, I guess there's Christina tonight, but for the conference, you've made it this far. Thank you so much for coming to our presentation. As Theodoric said, my name is Alyssa, and I am the co-founder and executive director of a new political pro-life organization called Right Now. Now, just a little bit about myself. I am the oldest of 9 children. Here they are. The youngest is Mary. She's the one holding her ears. You can find her in that position a lot. She is 8 years old, and there's actually a greater age difference between myself and Mary than there is between my mom and I. So me and my youngest sister, Mary, we are 24 years apart, and my mom and I are 19 years apart.
Wow.
And that's because when my mom was in her first year of university, she went to Trent in Peterborough. She experienced an unplanned pregnancy. Now she's one of 11, so she comes from a big Christian family. So she didn't want to tell her parents right away. She didn't want to tell my dad right away. So she went to the nearest hospital and she took a pregnancy test, and she was sitting in the waiting room waiting for the results. And the doctor came in and said, yes, you are pregnant. And the very next words out of the doctor's mouth were, I'm pro-baby and everything, but I can schedule you an abortion. Because all that doctor saw was a young girl, alone and pregnant, and without talking to her about any other options, about what she wanted to do, about her pregnancy, the very first thing that doctor offered her was an abortion. And even after acknowledging the humanity of her unborn child. And that baby was me. So even though I didn't know that story growing up right away, I really do believe it's one of the driving forces behind why I chose to work full-time in the pro-life movement. Now, after university, I got a job right away for another pro-life organization called Campaign Life Coalition, and I was their youth coordinator. So I was able to do a lot of cool things. I was one of the major organizers of the National March for Life in Ottawa. I took a delegation to the United Nations to lobby on behalf of Canadian women and girls. And then in 2015, I joined forces with Jonathan Van Maren and the folks at CCBR. And we got into a big bus with Justin Trudeau's face and a big X. And we literally drove from one end of the country to the other in the No to Trudeau campaign. Now, the reason why we did this was not to pick on the Liberals. My family was growing up were Liberal voters, but Justin Trudeau was the first Liberal leader to disallow any pro-life candidates from running for the party. And so we got people to deliver postcards, to volunteer for their candidates, to do what they could that election. And we had politicians, some very popular pro-life politicians who would call us, and they would say, Alyssa, every single time a pro-life bill or motion was put forward in the House of Commons, I voted in favor of it. When the infamous abortionist Dr. Henry Morgentaler received the Order of Canada, we spoke out against it. And now there's a pivotal election. I've won for 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, and now I could lose my seat. I need volunteers. And so I would get on the phones, I would call through our list, I would do what I could. And what I realized was that very few pro-life supporters were interested in volunteering for their pro-life candidate. It made a lot of people uncomfortable, they were unsure of what to do. And so one of the results from that election is we went from having 80 pro-life MPs to 40. We lost half of our pro-life MPs and some by less than 100 votes. And so I knew that if we were ever going to push the political yardsticks forward, we had to stop doing the same things over and over again. Because at my job, I would go to work in January, we would help organize the March for Life, the 40 Days for Life, we would do the life chains, we would sell our Christmas cakes and do our Christmas fundraiser. I'd go home and I'd come back and we'd do it all over again. And we weren't moving forward politically, we were moving backwards. And so I called up my friend Scott. I had known him for a little while. And I'm gonna pass the microphone over to him and let him tell his side of the story.
So I'm the other guy, a random guy apparently. My name is Scott Hayward, and do you have the clicker, Alyssa? There you go. That's me. My name is Scott, and I come from a small farming town in western Manitoba called Brandon, home of the Wheat Kings. I'll like to tell people if they ever come from my home in Brandon, if they ever want to come to Calgary, they just head down the street, turn left, turn right, and then 10 hours later they're here. So a little bit more about me, if you haven't been able to figure it out, is I'm a really big nerd. And I started following politics on a day-to-day basis when I was 10 years old. So that was during the 2000 federal election, so that'll date me right there. And I remember being, really disappointed with the result of that election. But what made me realize is that if you want to actually advance a particular public policy agenda, you have to get involved in the political process. And so when I was 14 years old, I purchased my first membership in a political party. And since then, I've been involved in over 30 campaigns on a municipal, provincial, and federal level. Now, during my time in high school, I became more involved in, mathematics and business. I actually graduated high school with 2 diplomas, my regular diploma and a business technology diploma. With that, I went to university, got my Bachelor of Business Administration degree, and then finally with that, a few years after that, I entered public practice, and I earned my Chartered Professional Accountancy designation. So I still have those letters. I'm a CPA to this day. To fellow CPAs in the room. Now, it was during that time, when I was working toward my designation in public practice, is when I met Alyssa. She had come out to Manitoba in the spring of 2013 to talk about, what was happening politically in the pro-life movement across Canada. And we had struck up a friendship, and over the next couple of years, she had encouraged and cajoled and maybe even threatened me a little bit to leave public practice and go work full-time in the political pro-life movement. And for me, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity and a beautiful marriage between 2 really big passions in my life. Number 1 being politics, because I had followed that since I was 10 years old. But number 2 also being the pro-life issue. Because having grown up in a practicing Catholic home, the pro-life issue is something that we did and still do to this day talk about at least once a week. Whether it be at brunch on Sunday or around the supper table during the weeknight, it's something that I grew up with. And so in just over 4 years ago, in September of 2015, I left all my family and friends back home in Manitoba, moved 2,500 kilometers across the country to downtown Toronto, which was a really big change for this prairie boy. And I started working full-time in the political pro-life movement. Now, if you will recall, when that was in September 2015, that was during the last federal election campaign in 2015. I moved in the middle of that campaign. And in that campaign, we went from having 80 pro-life members of parliament to 40. So just like that, we had lost half of our pro-life representation in the House of Commons. And so Alyssa and I, we were talking about it, and we were saying, if we keep doing the same things politically in the pro-life movement we've been doing for the last 40 years, we're going to end up in the exact same place in the next 40 years. And that's with Canada having absolutely no law whatsoever on abortion, one of 2 countries in the world where that's the case, the only democracy in the world where that's the case. And so we decided that we had to start something new, we have to start something unique, and above all, we have to start something effective, and that meant starting right now. So we just want to play this video right here. It's of Stella Ambler, a former pro-life member of Parliament. This is her speaking at the 2015 National March for Life. And we just like to play this video so that all of us in this room, including Alyssa and myself, ask each other and ask ourselves, are we actually doing the things that our pro-life publicly elected representatives are asking us to do in order to get more pro-life politicians elected?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Parliament Hill. Thank you so much for being here. That's what I want to tell you, but I do have 2 requests for you. I want you to do 2 things when you get home. First of all, I'd like you to write your member of Parliament about the Carter Supreme Court decision lifting the ban on physician-assisted suicide. I want you to let all the MPs know, not just the ones that are here today, that this is not a good idea and that you don't support it. Let them know. Send a strongly worded email or letter to your member of Parliament about the Supreme Court decision. Secondly, I want you to find out who your pro-life candidate is, whether it's in your riding or the neighboring riding, and I want you to help them get elected this October the 19th. Those are my two messages. Thank you so much for coming out today.
So when we started right now, almost 4 years ago in January 2016, a lot of people asked us, do we really need another pro-life organization in Canada? We have lots of different pro-life organizations out there. It's a legitimate enough of a question. And so we just like to quickly go over this slide to show you, and I'm sure you're all familiar with what does the pro-life movement actually look like in Canada. So you have your educational organizations that are out there changing people's hearts and minds. You have organizations like LifeCanada, local right to life groups. I think one of the best examples would be the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, CCBR. They're out there changing hearts and minds, creating pro-lifers. You have pastoral groups. These are the people that work on the front lines with abortion-minded women to really encourage them to make life-affirming choices. These are our last line of defense when all of us aren't able to, make sure that we have the right protections and supports for women not to make those sorts of decisions. So you think of crisis pregnancy centers, places like that. And then you have political organizations. So you have lobbyists like ARPA, We Need a Law. So they go, I like to say that I'm the boring accountant, Tabitha's the fun lawyer. She actually gets to write this stuff and propose it and lobby for it. So that's what they do. They go meet with people who've already been elected to encourage them to vote for pro-life legislation or to discourage them from voting for legislation that puts our issues further back. But what you'll notice is, before our organization existed, there was no organization in Canada that was solely dedicated to nominating and electing pro-life politicians. Because the fact of the matter is that you can go and change all the hearts and minds as you want, which is an innately good thing to do. Or you can go lobby all the politicians who have already been elected as you want, which is also innately a good thing to do. But if you do not have the right number of butts in the seats in the House of Commons, when the clerk of the House is going down the center aisle and calling each and every single member of Parliament out by name on whether they're going to sit or stand for our pro-life legislation, then again, we're going to end up in the exact same place in the next 40 years where we've been for the last 40 years, and that's with absolutely no legislation whatsoever on abortion. One quote I like to use, and I believe is attributed to Einstein, is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. So that's the question, is how do we win? The way that we win is that we have a voting majority in the House of Commons and in our provincial legislatures. So currently in the House of Commons in Canada, there are 338 members of Parliament. That means that if we want to actually introduce and pass pro-life legislation, we need 170 pro-life members of Parliament. That's not 170 Liberals, it's not 170 Conservatives, it's 170 pro-life members of Parliament. And that is what we're working toward as we go forward. And one of the newest people we've been able to get in, I'm going to get Alyssa up here to speak about him and how he was our example going forward and is our example going forward to build toward those pro-life majorities.
Now, I met Sam back in 2016. I was at a conference in Ottawa, and he was there with his aunt and uncle, and he introduced himself. He had seen me at the March for Life a few times, and so he said, hi Alyssa, nice to meet you. We chatted for a bit, and he said, Alyssa, I have political ambitions. I want to run for public office. And so this is this picture. Imagine him 3 years ago. The very first question I asked him was, great, Sam, how old are you? And he said, 18. And I just kind of laughed to myself and said, great, nice to meet you, and went on my merry way. Now, Sam added me on Facebook, and a few months later, I got that Facebook Messenger alert. He had messaged me and said that the progressive conservative leader of Ontario, Tim Hudak, who was also his MPP in his riding, stepped down, and he wanted to run there and be the MPP. And so I said, Sam, what's your plan? And his plan was actually very good. Now, Sam's last name is Oosterhoff. It's a very Dutch last name. He comes from the Dutch Reformed Church. And in the Niagara area, there are a lot of Dutch Reformed churches. And so he said, it's great, Alyssa. I'm calling through my church contacts for selling memberships. It's like shooting fish out of a barrel. Everybody's saying yes. But the problem was, it was just Sam and his brother Aaron sitting in their farmhouse every single day calling through their lists. And even though everybody was saying yes, it was just the two of them, and it wasn't enough people to actually sell enough memberships to win. And so I was living in downtown Toronto at the time, so I drove down to Niagara. I met with the local Right to Life group there. We met in this small little church in the forest. It was very underground. And Sam came and we talked and we told them what they needed to do. And everybody signed up to help Sam once a week. And so they were calling, they were phone calling, they were door knocking, and they were selling memberships. Now before I go any further, Sam was running against two other major candidates. One was the current president of the entire PC Party of Ontario and a former MP named Rick Dijkstra, also a very Dutch last name, and a lot of political experience. He was also running against a sitting city councillor named Tony Quirk. So in all the media and all the coverage, it was Rick versus Tony. Nobody talked about Sam. I don't even think half the riding knew he was running. But the social conservatives, the pro-lifers, they knew he was running, and they were the ones who were signing up. They were the ones who were buying memberships, who were selling memberships, who were phone calling, and who were door knocking. So nomination day came, the candidates gave their final speeches. Rick sits down, straightening his tie, getting ready to deliver his victory speech, and they call the winner, and it is none other than 19-year-old Sam Osterhoff. Now, usually in nominations, sometimes people win by 10, 15, 20 votes. Sam won by over 150 votes. So that's a lot in a nomination. So it wasn't even close. Now, the best thing about Sam was that for the next 2 weeks after he won, he did not do any interviews because there was a huge underground moment. It was a huge underdog victory. And so he kind of laid low, he kind of got his composure, got his talking points down, and finally he did his very first interview. I think it was with a woman in CTV, and it was very intimate, it was on the couch, and she said, the very first question she said was, we've been hearing a lot of rumors, Sam, and we want to know, where do you stand on the issue of abortion? And he looked at her right in the eyes and he said, oh, I'm 100% pro-life. And so then there was this pause, and she kind of didn't know what to say, and she just said, okay, and went on to the next question. She wasn't used to politicians giving such straightforward answers. And just a few months ago at the Toronto March for Life, Sam stood up in front of the cameras, his fellow MPPs, the pro-life movement, the news, and said that it's one of his missions to make abortion unthinkable in his lifetime. Now, I'm not going to say that every single politician that we help will be as strong or as ardent as Sam, but as Scott said, all we need is those politicians at the very least to stand up at the right time and vote the right way in order for us to finally pass pro-life legislation in Canada. Back in February of 2018, I actually left downtown Toronto and moved out to Alberta to help on the provincial election. And this was a very unique experience because for those of you who don't know Alberta politics, we had two conservative parties. They merged together and they formed a new party, which meant we had an opportunity to really create a lot of pro-lifers in this new party. And so we had over 52 pro-life candidates in the nomination. And let's just say that the Alberta media does not represent the Alberta population, and the media went absolutely ballistic about this. So in all the major news articles, and in some not so major, they were talking about how we were infiltrating, we were doing this, we were doing that. It was all negative. I just stopped doing media after a while. But the good thing about it is that we were able to elect a majority of them. I think it was 28 and counting. And we elected some of the most ardent pro-life politicians I think that Canada has ever seen. So I'm going to play for you a small video. This just happened about 2 weeks ago. It's of a current MLA. Her name is Michaela Glasgow. She's 26 years old. And the NDP put forward a motion. It was called Motion 506. And it sought to expand abortion access across Alberta. And so Michaela, one of the youngest female members of the Legislative Assembly, stood up and spoke against it.
But it is my personal conviction that all human life is sacred and should be protected. I am unapologetically and unreservedly pro-life, and my constituents were aware of this when they sent me to this place. I imagine that everyone here has their own opinion on abortion and for their own unique reasons, but I'm not here to criticize the opinions of others. In fact, I'm proud to be a member of a caucus that recognizes the myriad of ways that one can approach this topic. We are all entitled to our own beliefs, I respect the member for St. Albert's right to her opinion, and in return, I hope that her and her colleagues would respect mine. That is democracy, after all. But my hopes that the honourable member will do that, Mr. Speaker, are quite low. Because time and time again, I have seen her and her colleagues take aim at me and my other colleagues for not falling in lockstep with their ideology. I stand here today to not only give a voice to the voiceless, the unborn, but also to the many Albertans and Albertan women who do not fall in lockstep with that former government's ideology. During the election and in my nomination, I met with countless young families, women, girls, men, everyone in between. Many of them hold similar views like the ones that I do. These Albertans are compassionate. They give generously to agencies for mothers experiencing a crisis pregnancy. They support families. They objectively and without judgment counsel young women, praying for them and giving them shelter and other necessities. They set up programs and centers that help young mothers get back on their feet, no matter their choice, and they work to make life better for women and families in times of great need. These Albertans do not deserve to be vilified, Mr. Speaker. They deserve to be heard. Mr. Speaker, I'm a young woman, and as such, I do take women's health very seriously. Many women struggle with real reproductive health-related issues, many of which go undiagnosed or are dismissed by medical practitioners entirely. Mr. Speaker, I am pro-life because I believe that all life is precious and worthy of dignity and respect. It is not something that I am ashamed of. It is a conviction that I and countless Albertans hold deeply and defend fervently. We are not a marginal portion of the population. The members opposite have been scowling at me this whole time, and if history is any indicator, the nastiness has only begun. But quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't care. I have been open and transparent about my views from day one. My constituents know where my conscience is on this, Mr. Speaker, and many voted for me because of it. And while the NDP turn inside out and feign outrage over any time the words free and speech are used in the same sentence, I am proud to be in a party that celebrates and encourages diversity, a party that allows me to speak and vote my conscience on matters such as these.
Now the funniest thing to me about that is maybe a few days later, there was another bill, and so Michaela was leaving the legislature, and so all the media was there, CBC, and they said to her, they stuck the mic in her face, and they said, Michaela, where do you stand on the issue of abortion? Not only are there politicians like Michaela, but also like Dan Williams, and both of these MLAs were I'm not going to take any credit for Dan Williams' victory. He won like 99% of the vote in his constituency in Peace River, where also Arnold is from, so it's a very conservative area. But he just put forward a bill this past week to implement conscience rights for healthcare providers, and the only other province that has this piece of legislation is Manitoba. So the point is to say that when pro-lifers show up, pro-lifers win. We do have these candidates who are running, and they will speak up, and they will put forward this legislation, and they will vote. But it's up to the pro-life movement, it's up to all of you in this room, it's up to me to actually show up for them and help them get elected. That's the only way we're going to move forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Scott for him to talk a little bit about Ontario.
A place to stand, a place to grow. So about 18 months or so ago, there was a provincial election in Ontario. It was the first time that the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario won an election there since 2001. So it's been quite some time. Now, at dissolution, when the election was called in Ontario, there were only about 2 pro-life members of provincial parliament out of 124. Now that we're up to 11 pro-life MPPs at least, and that is far more than the entire Liberal Party of Ontario caucus, which was, this slide is old 7, now it's down to 5. They used to need a minivan to fit their entire caucus, now they just need a Prius. So I guess they're trying to be environmentally friendly. But that means that in Ontario that we only need another 52 pro-life members of parliament. Now my colleague from Media Law, Tabitha, her and I have been working over the last little while as with some other people in Ontario to go out and reach out to our pro-life our pro-life caucus people within Ontario, and to get them to reach out to their caucus mates to find out whether or not they might be pro-life, and to see what kind of bills and legislation that they would vote for. I hope that you were all at her presentation earlier this morning when she was talking about all the different types of pro-life legislation that we can pass at a provincial level that will reduce abortion numbers by quite a bit. Now, during the leadership race for the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, there were a number of people who ran, including Doug Ford, who's now the Premier of Ontario. And in the interviews that we did with all four of the candidates who are running for the leadership, Doug had indicated in his interview that he would be open to supporting legislation that would require parental consent or parental notification for female minors who are seeking to get an abortion in the province of Ontario. And we do have a video of this, right, Alyssa? And so this is just a video of Doug and the way he answered the question when he was asked by CBC in Windsor on whether or not he would actually did support this type of legislation.
Well, I know, I don't know why politicians are afraid to talk about this, even though we're talking about the election. You want to throw that at me, that's fine. My friends, when you have to give a note to your kids when they're 12 and 13 years old to go on a field trip. You have to approve, even get their tonsils out. And you don't have to approve and you keep secret with a 12 and 13-year-old? I don't know too many parents that would approve any of their kids going on a field trip without their knowledge. I don't see anyone ever approving an operation on their children when they're 12 and 13 years old without approval. Next question? That's it. Thank you, folks.
Doug won that leadership race by about 800 votes out of, it was tens of thousands that were cast across Ontario. Our organization right now is responsible for selling no fewer than 1,000 memberships in those key ridings, and that is why Doug Ford is now the Premier of Ontario today. So, working with Tabitha and our friends at We Know Law and a few other organizations, we will see what kind of legislation we can put forward over the next couple of years provincially in Ontario. Now that brings us to the most recent election. We talked about Alberta, we talked about Ontario, and now we would like to talk a little bit about the federal election here across Canada. So the federal election occurred, as you know, on October 21st, about 4 years after the last federal election. And like I mentioned earlier, in the last federal election, we went from having 80 pro-life members of parliament to 40. So we lost half of our pro-life MPs. So our goal going forward in this election was to try and start to begin the process of reversing that. Our goal was to find the 50 most winnable ridings for pro-life candidates so we can have 50 additional pro-life members of parliament. The way we did this is we looked at the results from the 2015 federal election and we said, okay, who are the pro-abortion candidates that won their election by the smallest total number of votes? Because they're going to be the most vulnerable. We targeted those ridings, and over the course of 2.5 years, we went into those ridings, we built up our organization's list in those ridings. We found well-rounded pro-life candidates who were from professional backgrounds, own their own businesses, they might be tradespeople, they might be of a certain ethnic minority, which would be really important in certain ridings, such as in Vancouver or the Toronto areas. And we were very, very successful. So we had a wonderful slate of pro-life candidates going into the federal election. And so when we were doing this, it's interesting. We kind of have to find a balance at our organization right now because we want to be effective and we want to make sure that we actually do win these nominations and do win these elections. But at the same time, we don't want our pro-abortion political opponents to know what we're up to. We want them to wake up one day when we do pass an amendment to the criminal code and they're wondering what the heck happened. And by then it's too late. But it's kind of hard to operate that quietly when you're having so much success. And so the media, particularly in Quebec, picked up on what we were doing, and they actually, during the election, covered a little bit of what we were up to. And so this video from RAD, which is a TV show with LifeCanada, covered what we were doing for the federal election.
Les députés d'Arrière-Ban auront malgré tout le droit de soumettre des projets de loi pour limiter l'accès à l'avortement. Et justement, des militants anti-avortement travaillent fort pour faire élire des candidats qui vont défendre leurs valeurs au Parlement.
Between May 1st when we started and July 15th, we knocked on over 150,000 doors.
Wow, c'est a lot of
And those 50 rallies. Yep.
Le mouvement contre l'avortement au Canada se rajeunit et il s'organise en s'inspirant de stratégies qui ont eu du succès aux
You
États-Unis.
have some kids at home who are in high school who are pro-life. I encourage them to also purchase memberships.
Scott Hayward a mis de côté sa carrière de comptable agréé il y a quelques années pour cofonder un des groupes anti-avortement les plus en vue au Canada en ce moment.
Hey everyone, Scott Hayward here from Right Now.
Fini les manifestations devant des cliniques. Le groupe Right Now fait dans la stratégie politique.
If you want to see a change in public policy, you have to get involved in the political process.
Leur but, c'est d'investir les lieux de pouvoir pour ultimement faire adopter des lois qui vont diminuer le plus possible le nombre d'avortements au pays.
What gets people elected is actually getting involved in the nominations and knocking on doors. That's it. And so if pro-lifers want to increase the number of pro-life members of parliament or members of our legislative assemblies, that is what they have to do, and we exist to facilitate that.
Et il semble que ça marche. La première réussite que s'attribue Right Now, c'est la victoire en 2016 à l'Assemblée législative de l'Ontario de Sam Osterhoff.
We pledged to fight to make abortion unthinkable in our lifetime.
À 19 ans, il a surpris tout le monde en remportant la course pour devenir le candidat du Parti progressiste conservateur dans sa circonscription contre un politicien de longue date avant d'être élu député. Une des clés pour Right Now, c'est de vendre des cartes de membres du parti à ses bénévoles pour qu'ils puissent voter lors des courses à l'investiture et faire élire des candidats anti-avortement.
Sam is one of many. He's the first for us, and many more to come that will get elected to our federal provincial legislatures.
Right Now se vante aussi d'avoir aidé en Alberta 30 députés qui se disent pro-vie à gagner l'investiture et à se faire élire lors des dernières élections provinciales il y a quelques mois.
For the election here federally coming up in October, we've been focused on 50 ridings.
Pour les élections fédérales, Right Now a lancé l'opération 50 pour faire élire 50 nouveaux députés anti-avortement à Ottawa.
We looked at the returns, the numbers from the last federal election in 2015, and we focused on those ridings that had the smallest total number of votes, where a pro-life candidate in 2015 lost by.
Pas question pour eux de révéler quels candidats ils appuient. Ils nous disent seulement qu'ils sont dans presque toutes les provinces, même au Québec. Right Now calcule qu'il y avait 58 députés pro-vie à la dissolution de la Chambre des communes. Pour faire élire une majorité et ainsi pouvoir changer les lois, ça leur en prendrait 170.
Realistically, can we go from 58 to 170 pro-life MPs? No, that's not realistic. We have to build toward it, so it's going to take a couple electoral cycles.
Right Now a seulement 2 employés, mais le groupe du pouvoir compte sur un bassin de centaines de bénévoles.
Without the volunteers, nothing happens.
Et pour en recruter toujours plus, Scott et sa collègue Alyssa donnent des ateliers un peu partout au pays.
Watching pro-lifers door knock, 2 huge things, numbers and influence.
Les bénévoles qui cognent aux portes ne parlent pas d'avortement. Leur mandat est d'identifier les électeurs qui soutiennent leurs candidats pour les inciter à voter le jour des élections. En consultant la page Facebook de Right Now, j'ai appris que le groupe allait aussi dans les écoles secondaires confessionnelles recruter de jeunes bénévoles. Dès 14 ans, les Canadiens peuvent devenir membres de la plupart des partis et voter notamment lors d'une course à l'investiture.
We don't target schools, right? But we don't reach out to schools. They reach out to us. Any group, organization that reaches out to us that wants us to come and talk to their organization, we're more than happy to do, which sometimes includes schools. So yeah, there are a lot of young people, like you mentioned earlier, that are part of our organization. We get them connected and we get them involved. The interesting thing about pro-lifers, surprise, surprise, is they tend to have lots of kids. So advantage to us. To draw from them are probably our political position.
On entend souvent que le droit à l'avortement au Canada est tellement bien protégé par la jurisprudence, par la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés, que ça ne sert à rien de parler des stratégies des opposants. Mais ce n'est pas l'avis de Véronique Pronovo.
Cette volonté de changer les mentalités, ça existe, c'est réel. Et éventuellement, ça peut avoir un poids un peu plus important, justement, si on réussit à convaincre la population que ça prend loi, que l'avortement libre et accessible sur demande, c'est une position extrême. Donc, si on réussit à changer ce paradigme-là, effectivement, le changement de mentalité peut mener à des changements politiques importants aussi.
Les opposants à l'avortement ne s'en cachent pas. Ce sont des changements qu'ils veulent.
I think that and it's going to be shocking to the world, how much success that we are going to have here in Canada over the next 10 years, from my basic calculations, just by looking at the numbers.
So for our Operation 50 tour, we traveled across the country multiple times. Ask Scott, there was a lot of Backstreet Boys going on in that car. He knows all the words now.
Not enough.
And we would divide and conquer. So Scott took over in the east and I took over in the west. And so I would drive regularly from Calgary to Vancouver. I think I did it 3 times in 5 months over the summer to recruit and train and train people on how easy it is to actually help pro-life candidates get elected, how easy it is to door knock. Because as someone who's worked in the pro-life movement for almost 10 years, I have done it all. I have used abortion victim photography, I've done the 40 Days for Life, the March for Life. One time I was doing my internship program at my old job and we were doing sidewalk chalk slogans, like pro-life slogans on the sidewalk. And the owner of my favorite pub came out and took a swing at my face. It was very unfortunate. I could never go to that pub again. But these are the types of things that I've done. And the easiest thing by far is door knocking for a pro-life candidate. It is so incredibly simple because you're not there to debate with anyone, to argue with anyone. All you're there to do is to identify supporters. Hi, my name's Alyssa. I'm with the Mark Warawa campaign. Can Mark count on your support this election? Yes, no, next door. It's just that easy. And if they ask you about anything, about where does Mark stand on pipelines or the environment or social issues, you just say, he would love to talk to you about this. Give them the pamphlet, it has contact information, and that's it. The candidates don't even want you to respond to these questions because they don't want you to misrepresent them. So it was just about training people on how simple it is because our goal was to have 20 pro-life volunteers for each of the 50 ridings. So we needed 1,000 volunteers. And one of the ways that we would help convince them is to show them this next video about a former MP named Florence Tote. Now, with our efforts, we were able to recruit over 650 pro-life door knockers, which equaled 3,000 door knocking hours per week. Now, it is very difficult for political campaigns to get door knockers, any type of door knockers. So when you have 10, 15, 20 pro-lifers coming in regularly to those campaign offices, the politicians take notice, the campaign managers take notice, and all the staff take notice, and that greatly impacts. Because back at my old job in 2015, I was working 9 to 5, and then every single day, Monday to Friday, I would help a different pro-life candidate in the GTA. So I had my Monday candidates, my Tuesday candidates, and so forth. And so when you walk into a campaign office, it's not like what you see in the movies and television. There's not people everywhere, and it's crazy, and there's phones and people running around. It's very quiet. There are very few people who actually volunteer. And so when I would go out door knocking, I would oftentimes get put with the candidate themselves. And so you'd be walking down the street and they would say to you, I've never seen you before, why are you here? Why are you helping? And you would say, you're a pro-life candidate, I'm a pro-life supporter, and I'm here because of that. And that has a great impact because we're not just calling them when a bill or motion's being put forward and yelling at them to vote a certain way, but they have that relationship with us. They know us, and we actually helped get them elected. And that's so incredibly important. And so that's something that we were able to do this election. So I'm just going to hand it over to Scott, and he'll tell you the good and the bad of what came from that.
Yeah, so here are our results. We wanted to elect another 50 pro-life members of parliament this past federal election. what we were able to do is increase the number of pro-lifers in the House of Commons to 68. So we have 15 new pro-life members of Parliament from coast to coast. So on October 21st, Canada federally was more pro-life than the day before. So unlike the last federal election, we're going forward in the right direction. Of the 53 pro-life members of Parliament who ran for re-election this time, unlike 40 of them losing, only one of them lost. And that was Harold Albrecht and Kitchener-Conestoga. Harold, unfortunately, was one of 3 pro-life candidates, winnable pro-life candidates that lost in their ridings because of a split vote with a PPC candidate, a pro-life PPC candidate. Harold lost his riding by 233 votes out of over 42,000 cast, which was by about 0.023%. And the PPC candidate won about 778. So even if half of those votes went to Harold, we would have had a 100% retention rate. So that's unfortunate. However, a good thing is that there were a number of pro-abortion, long-time prominent members of Parliament that lost. Who here is from the great province of Saskatchewan and Rider Nation? You have a giant slayer there. His name is Michael Cram, and he took down Ralph Goodale, who at one point was the only federally and provincially elected Liberal in over 1 million square kilometers. And it wasn't even a close. Michael Cram defeated him by something like 7,000 votes. Is that right? It was quite a bit, and he's a very strong pro-life member of Parliament now. I think Saskatchewan is pretty close, Kathy can attest to this or not, to having almost 100% pro-life representation from a province. So way to go, Saskatchewan, for speaking to that. The only female Conservative Party of Canada member of Parliament from Quebec, Sylvie Boucher, and other members of Parliament can or cannot attest to this. She was very, very pro-abortion, and because she was the only female Quebecois member of caucus, she had an amplified voice. She lost in Beauport-les-Milieux by about 2,500 votes. So we lost a pro-abortion voice there, which is fantastic. And then another amplified pro-abortion voice in the Conservative Party of Canada caucus was Lisa Reyes. And Kathy will remember this for sure. Lisa was given extra time to speak against our motion to defeat the only pro-abortion policy in the Conservative Party of Canada policy document at the last policy convention. She got up there and speak to the entire crowd of 3,000 people about how we should have this pro-abortion policy there. She lost her riding by over 6,000 votes. She got actually destroyed in a very safe Conservative riding. So while we're adding and having more and more pro-lifers being added to the Conservative caucus, we're also shedding the pro-abortion members as well at the same time. So it was going forward very much in a good and positive direction. So of the 22 new Conservative Party of Canada members of Parliament, 68% of them are pro-life. At least 68%, and by our calculations, well over half of the Conservative Party of Canada caucus is now pro-life. So we're getting there, we're moving forward. Overall, looking at a big picture, as you know, the Justin Trudeau majority government was reduced to a minority. So in the 2015 election, the Justin Trudeau Liberals won 184 votes. And this election, they won 157. You need 170 in order to maintain a majority, so they are not at that majority. And the importance about that is that the committees of the House of Commons and the committees of the Senate reflect the makeup of the House of Commons and the makeup of the Senate. So when the Liberals had a majority in the House of Commons, they would have a majority on the Justice Committee, on the Ethics Committee, on the Finance Committee. But now that they have a minority in the House of Commons, they also have a minority on that committee. So, for example, on the Ethics Committee, if all the opposition MPs on that committee decide, yeah, we want to open up an investigation to SNC-Lavalin, the Liberal MPs cannot vote that down. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens going forward for the Liberal Party of Canada in the House of Commons. Now, one thing we do have to talk about, though, and I've been told to not be too harsh on you guys about this, is the bad. Because it wasn't all good news. And one thing, if I can just ask you folks to do, I just want to do a little experiment here. I want you to all close your eyes. I want you to all close your eyes. Humor me on this. You too, Andrew. And I want you to very carefully stand up if you are very angry that Justin Trudeau got re-elected. Okay. If you're not standing up, that's concerning. All right, sit back down. Sit back down. We'll do this again. Now I want you to close your eyes. Indulge me again. Close your eyes. And very honestly answer this. I want you to only stand up if you knocked on doors at least once a week for your pro-life candidate. Now I want everyone to open up their eyes. This is the problem. Do you see what the problem is?
We didn't have a pro-life candidate.
Okay, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. We'll fix that. But here's the thing, is that we only won 15 of the 50 ridings that we are targeting. And there are things that are in our control, and there are things outside of our control. And I understand that. You might live in a rural, remote area where your candidate is pro-life, and they don't necessarily need your help because they're winning by, Arnold Viersen margins. Or you live in a rural, remote area where you don't have a pro-life candidate or a winnable pro-life candidate. It is more than an hour drive to go help out another candidate. But we have a database of over 20,000 people. And in our database of over 20,000 people, less than 4% actually go out there and knocked on doors. Pro-lifers win when pro-lifers show up. And pro-lifers lose when pro-lifers don't show up. As a movement, we are our own worst enemies. No one in this country, there is no movement in this country that has as many people in these swing ridings and a growing base of them than as the pro-life movement. We have the machine, we have the method, it just needs to be fueled by volunteer hours. So next time when you get a phone call, or when you get a text, or when you get an email from Right Now asking you to buy a membership, to show up at a nomination meeting, or to go out and knock on doors one shift a week for a 5-week campaign, the answer will always be yes. Very good. I don't want to have to come back here in 2 or 4 years and have this conversation again. But here's some interesting things. Like I mentioned, there are things in our control and there are things outside our control. So like I said, we had won 15 of those 50 ridings that we were targeting. If we had the right number of door knockers in all of those ridings, we would have won 30. We would have won a further 50. So that was something that was in our control. But for the other 20, it was outside of our control. And a lot of those 20 were in this little part of the country called the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, or as they like to call it, the center of the universe. Is that right? How many people here are from the GTA?
Originally.
Oh, okay, represent. The Greater Toronto Area is a region of about 7 million people. They have about 58 federal seats, and it's the only part of the country, besides parts of Vancouver, where they're called swing ridings, where they flip from one political party to another almost every single election. The only time that the Conservative Party of Canada has ever won and increased the total number of votes in the GTA and the percentage of the vote was in 2011, and that also just happens to be the only time that the Conservative Party of Canada had a pro-life policy in their platform, and that was defunding abortions overseas through the Harper initiative of the Muskoka initiative. That is the only time. And so my message to the people within the higher echelons of the Conservative Party of Canada is that if you want to win the GTA, you have to be unabashedly pro-life. You will never win the GTA if you're not unabashedly pro-life. The GTA, for those of you who are from the GTA and did the excellent work of knocking on doors, the GTA is the only part of the country where the Conservative Party of Canada saw their total votes decrease and the Liberals increase. And that is a big reason why. We experienced it and talked to a lot of our pro-life candidates on the ground. We targeted 19 of those 58 ridings in the GTA. The big reason why they did not have pro-lifers come out not only to vote but volunteer, why they didn't come out because the party did not offer them anything. And that's something that we need to change. And one of the best ways to change it is that coming up in Toronto, there it is again, Toronto, in April, from the 16th to the 18th, the Conservative Party of Canada is having their policy convention. And when pro-lifers show up, pro-lifers win. The last time, at the last Conservative Policy Convention, we had a motion put forward to eliminate the only pro-abortion policy in the party. Of the 3,000 delegates that were there, we lost that vote by 107. That's less than one extra pro-life delegate for 1 out of every 3 ridings. So you have an opportunity to keep moving our political parties forward in a positive pro-life direction. And at the end of the day, that's the biggest thing, is pro-lifers win when pro-lifers show up. I just kind of want to end my time with you here with a quick story, if that's okay. And some of you have heard this before, so you can go back to napping. But for those of you who haven't, I hope that you can gain some insight and some inspiration from this. The first time I was part of a municipal campaign, and I don't know what it's like for you folks in your hometowns, but my hometown of Brandon, Manitoba, when you run for city council, you run for a ward, like a mini riding, a specific geographic area of the city. The guy who I was helping out, in the ward that he was running in, he was running against a sitting city councillor who had been there for 28 straight years. So that's 7 back-to-back elections, that guy won. And it was well known in the community that my candidate that I was helping out, he was from, the right of center part of the political spectrum, if we could put it that way. And the ward that he was running in, the guy he was running against, was very pro-NDP and very pro-union, which is all well and fine, and a very pro-NDP and pro-union part of the city. So we had an uphill battle right from the get-go. But we did all the right things. We ran a textbook campaign because we knocked on doors, we recorded people's contact information, we contacted them throughout the campaign, we found out what their issues were, we reminded them to get out to vote. I don't know what they call it in your provinces, but we had ECEs, early childhood educators, that actually ran a play place on election day so people could drop off their kids to go vote. No excuses, only results. We ran everything perfectly. And the last night of the election campaign, it was a typical late October night in Manitoba because it was a mix of rain and sleet and hail, and I swear to God I saw a couple of snowflakes. It was awful, miserable weather, just the worst. And I was one of 2 people going out to knock on doors. The other guy had to put about an hour in because his kids had hockey or something like that, so there I was, knocking on doors by myself for 3 hours. And normally in that campaign, in a 3-hour period, I would be able to identify no fewer than about 10 to 15, maybe even 20 on a good day, extra supporters for our candidate. That night, going through all that weather, I was only able to identify 5. And I thought that was a big waste of time. I was already borderline about whether door knocking should happen or not. At the time when I was younger, I thought, this is antiquated, it's old-fashioned, it's not as effective. I can call, text, email, Facebook message, MSN message, because that's how long ago it was, more people than knock on doors. And I had a miserable time of it. I went in to the campaign office at the end of the night and said, here's a sheet of paper with the people, their name, and their contact information. Don't ever ask me to do this again. I'm never doing this again. I was driving home cold and miserable, and I made something that you should never do. I made a promise to myself that I would never door knock again. Because in those 3 hours, I could have been at home with like 5 blankets around me, warm, watching Netflix with a home-cooked meal. I could have been working to get better grades on my projects because I was at university at the time, or I could have been out, working, making more money, but I thought I will never door knock again. It doesn't make a difference. The next night was election night. The guy who we ran against, who had been there for 28 straight years, 7 straight elections, very pro-NDP and pro-union, the pro-NDP, pro-union part of the city, he won 430 votes. Our guy won 432. So, I'm not saying I won the election for that. But the point is that every little bit does make a difference. It does add up. And for us, for pro-lifers, if we want to see more Sam Osterhoffs, if we want to see more Arnold's or more Kathy's or whoever the case might be, you have to get out there and you have to knock on doors. So, when we come back here in 2 to 4 years, however long this, gosh-forsaken minority parliament lasts for, I will come back and I will tell you that we won 75 of the 50 seats that we were targeting because all of you got out there and door knocked. So I'm just going to pass it over to Alyssa to wrap this up.
Now, just really quickly, some people say, well, we can't achieve anything politically unless we change hearts and minds first. And I am not afraid to say I disagree with that completely. And the reason why is because of what happened in the States. When Roe versus Wade was first implemented, the American pro-life movement really put forward a human life amendment. They wanted to basically overturn Roe versus Wade. And for years and years, they tried to do that with no luck. And then they started to change their strategies a little bit. They started to put forward incremental pieces of legislation state by state by state. And under President Obama, arguably one of the most pro-abortion presidents in the entire United States, the pro-life movement was able to put forward over 200 pieces of pro-life legislation. So not only were they able to decrease the abortion rate by half, because these bills statistically decrease the abortion numbers, but now polls are showing that millennials are more pro-life than their parents. So these laws not only decreased the abortion number, but they changed hearts and minds, and that's what we can do here in Canada as well. So I always like to end my talk with this one quote. I've been doing it for 10 years and I won't stop. It was a quote that I read in a magazine called First Things, and I was doing a high school presentation on abortion and I came across it and I wrote it down. And I always end my talks with this because sometimes I feel depressed. Sometimes, when you win 15 out of 50, you're thinking, what are we doing? Why aren't we winning more? And you kind of get down on yourselves, and maybe things have happened like that to you as well. But then I read this quote, and it always makes me feel better. And it goes, "The journey has been long, and there are miles and miles to go. But from this convention, the word is carried to every neighborhood, every house of worship, every political office, every precinct of this, our beloved country. From this convention, the word is carried that until every human being, no matter how small or how weak, no matter how old or how burdensome, until every human being is protected in law and cared for in life, we shall not weary and we shall not rest. And in this, the greatest human rights struggle of our time and of all time, we shall overcome." Thank you.